one of interest to everybody, or really two of interest to everybody, except for Section 1, which does not meet on Monday. All the other sections will have a quiz through today's material next week. And the following week, we will meet in Enology building. Also, I urge you all to get your library problems done and in whenever your section leader has suggested a time, and I've suggested a time as 5 o'clock this afternoon, and I have several of them here. So Section 1 people only hand your library problem in, and you may hand them in tomorrow when you go to pick up your take-home quiz. Since there's no class on Monday, Section 1 will have a take-home quiz. They may be ready this afternoon, depending on how fast the secretaries get to work and how much work they have piled up on their desks. They'll certainly be ready at 8 o'clock in the morning. They may very well be ready any time after this afternoon. Whatever I told the Section 1 people in class as to where to pick them up and where to turn the papers in, it's 1019 Wixon. And then that brings me to one other subject, perhaps not of importance to very many, but about 40 missing quizzes are still outstanding. That is, people who have not taken the quizzes. These may be made up in 1019 Wixon, and you should do it now. Every year we'll have, in a class this size, we'll have people coming up after the final examination saying, I would like to make up quiz number 3 and quiz number 4. Well, I can tell you for the record now that just won't work. The final is the end, and the time to get them in is now, not later on. So go and take your makeup quizzes if you've missed a quiz. In addition to that, don't play the odds that you're going to use the library problem to fill in one of those missing quizzes. That's perfectly all right, but who knows, you might do better on the quiz than you did on one of the other quizzes. So don't penalize yourself by taking away one of your chances to raise your grade by doing your makeup quiz. And then finally, and this is of interest to everyone, the final examination, as you know, is on Saturday in the late afternoon. For those who cannot make, and that's the very beginning of the final examination week, for those who for various reasons, dead grandmothers and sick rich uncles and things like that, they should see Dr. Singleton in his office in Wixon. And they should see him immediately and put their names on his list, and he will make arrangements for you. But they will not be early arrangements, so you need not go to see him if you need to or want to take the final examination early. But he will arrange something else for you. Now, last time we got through Spain, more or less, we were busily involved in the two kinds of sherry at the very end, and I just will repeat again that one kind of sherry, the Fino, owes its original character to a very interesting yeast which not only conducts alcoholic fermentation first, but second, in a later stage of its activity, essentially reverses alcoholic fermentation and produces acetaldehyde as the end product. And this gives the wine a very specialized character. It also produces a type of wine which is fairly unique to Spain, although I should mention that our leader, our founder of modern microbiology, Louis Pasteur, studied these yeast in a little tiny region in the Jura Mountains of France, a wine which is called there Chateau Chalon. It's not a chateau at all. Chateau Chalon is a town. And just by chance, I was there last Thursday instead of being here, and that you could buy the wines there for these film yeast wines of the Jura for $6 a bottle. And I looked in the price list that came Monday of this week. You can buy the same wine for $12 a bottle in San Francisco. I don't think it's a great wine like sherry is a great wine, because it's not made from as ripe a grapes as sherry is made from. They have a hard time getting that alcohol content up to 14 or 15%, which is necessary to prevent acidification. But nevertheless, it's an interesting wine, and it shows that the process need not be unique to just the one region of Spain. As a matter of fact, we've used it in California here, and it's now being used commercially in South Africa and Australia and Cyprus. All those places have developed an industry using the film yeast. The other type of sherry, the Oloroso, does not owe its character to the film yeast, but owes its character to being kept for quite a long while and being sweet. Not all the phenols are terribly sweet. Some of them are a little bit of very rich wine is added to them, but in general, phenols tend to be on the dry side, or the film yeast wines tend to be on the dry side, and Olorosos tend to be on the sweet side. There are exceptions both ways on that, but that's the general character of it. Well, now we come to Italy, and it's the largest producing country in the world, not the highest consumption, but the largest production in terms of gallons, and has been almost every year for the last 10 years, although France and Italy alternate sometimes in having the highest production. Now, contrary to anything I'm going to say from now on, I love Italy. I love Italians. It's a wonderful place to visit, especially if you want to know something about the grandeur that was Rome, or the impressive accomplishments of the Renaissance, or if you just want to relax in a musical atmosphere, sort of poetic kind of existence that the Italians seem to have found, a joie de vivre type of life. At least that's the appearance it gives to many people. Or if you just want to visit churches and cathedrals and things like that. Or if you want to study folklore, it's perhaps the best place in the world for that. Probably the best place in the world to fall in love and not stay in love too long. There's a lot of other attractions. But it is, unfortunately, not the world's greatest quality producer of wines. And I've listed on the board now some reasons why I believe this to be true. I'm sure it's true, but why I think it got to be this way. First of all, because of religious beliefs, there is an overpopulation. I can simply give you the evidence of the millions and millions of Italians who have left Italy since 1900 to go to other places in the world to make their living because of the overcrowded conditions in Italy itself. This leads to what we call mixed plantings. The family, in order to survive, has to grow a certain amount of its food. And this amounts to about 60% of the Italian population. And so they plant tomatoes, grapevines, eggplants, onions, garlic, olives, pigs, chickens, children, and what have you, all on 1 or 2 little acres of land. The time comes to spray the grapes, but that's the time to pick up the potatoes. The time comes to prune the grapes, but that's the time they've got to take care of the cows and pigs and other things. So that nothing ever gets done just right in these mixed plantings. The Italians themselves give them the lovely name of promiscuous culture, which doesn't mean that anything promiscuous goes on in the vineyards, but as of quite recently, as much as 70% of all the grapes grown in Italy were grown in promiscuous culture or mixed plantings. Now that figure has changed in the last 3 or 4 years, so that perhaps now it's not more than 50% are in promiscuous culture. But that's a great handicap for any industry to start with, is where grapes are not the sole object of the farmer's attention, and he cannot give his full attention to it. Second, there is a survival from Roman times of growing grapes on trees. The typical scene of, you go through Tuscany, is the trees along the road, with the vines being carried by a wire from one to the other. Or if you go up in the mountains above Venice, which I hope you do because it's very beautiful, you see these miles and miles of arbors where vines are growing up on arbors like they were on trees and are being greatly overcropped. This is the plague of the Italian existence. Growing, as I said last time with respect to Portugal, growing grapes on trees means that they overcrop, means that they do not have a good leaf surface to cluster relation, and they never ripen. And this is the real problem of Italy, one of the real problems of Italy. The next is the small size of the vineyards, and that, of course, comes from this division of the land through this overpopulation that they have there. With all of the people they have, all the wineries they have, thousands of wineries and so forth, there are really only about 3 or 4 schools in all of Italy that are doing anything to train young people to enter the wine business. These are in that curious Italian kind of feeling. They are only training at the very top level. Everybody wants to be dottori in Italy. That's what the young people want to be. And so they are trained, you see, to be research scientists in schools and things like that. Italy has a number of good research institutes for studying wine, but they are woefully lacking on institutes to train people to make wine. And there's one thing to study wine in a laboratory, but it's quite a different thing to be able to make wine in a practical way and maintain the quality and improve the quality. I think the curriculum is at fault. Anytime that you just study wine as a technical object, you separate yourself from what it's tasting like. And I told this symposium that I was talking to last week in the Jura that I think that enologists tend to forget this, that the most important thing about wine is whether people like it or not whether enologists like it or not. That's quite a different thing. And so that I think the Italian scientific community may have forgotten something of that. There's a lack of Italian clientele from one region to another. As everybody knows, the Milanese hate the Tuscans hate the Napoleon, I can't say it now. Sicilians, then we'll say, because everybody hates the Sicilians, and vice versa, the Sicilians hate everybody else. This comes about from the fact that it's just about 120 years since Italy was divided between the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, the Kingdom of Milan, the Duchy, or whatever they called it, of Venice, and so forth. And it was not until Garibaldi and the Risorgimento reunited Italy, or united Italy for the first time since the Roman period, that Italy became one nation again, and just picked out the Tuscan language as being the right Italian to speak. Everybody else doesn't speak correct Italian in Italy because they had to pick one dialect to be the official Italian dialect, and they picked the Tuscan dialect to be that official dialect. But if you go to Naples, you hear a quite different kind of Italian than you do in Milano or than you do in Florence. Well, this means then if you look at a wine list in the north of Italy, you don't find very many Tuscan wines in it, maybe 1 or 2 Chiantis. But most of the wines you will find in it will be local wines, wines made in the north of Italy. And the same thing is true if you go to the south of Italy. If you go to Palermo, which I hope you do someday because it's got an absolutely fantastic church up on the hill above the town of Palermo, the capital of Sicily, you'll find 50 or 60 Sicilian wines on a wine list. And maybe 1 Naples wine, 1 Tuscan wine, and no wines from northern Italy. The Sicilians never heard of Milano, or wish they'd never heard of Milano, anyway. Then there's a lack of interest in wine as an aesthetic object. If 2 Frenchmen, I've said this before, perhaps maybe in this class, but it won't hurt repeating. If 2 Frenchmen go to dinner, they look at the menu quickly, and then they look at the wine list. and they decide now which wine is going to go with which dish, and they may change their order because they find a wine they just like to taste and so forth. And there may be a discussion of 15, 20 minutes between the two Frenchmen as to how the foods are going to be selected and which wines are going to be selected. Not so in Italy. Two Italian businessmen going out for a business lunch, they don't even order a wine. They just say, bring us the house wine. And they will concentrate on ordering the food if they're at all interested in what they're eating. And then they go on and talking about politics and the church and their children and their mistresses and all sorts of other things, but never talk anything about the wine, never discuss it, have no interest in it. And as a matter of fact, wine in the small trattoria, the small hotels, small restaurants in Italy, is sold by weight. They put a liter on the thing, and then afterward they take what's left of it and weigh it, and you pay for what you drank, and you don't pay for any more. The system is all right, but it shows that they're really not very much interested in the wine. Wine is another condiment to an Italian, just like salt and pepper. He needs it just like the Frenchman needs bread, but he doesn't really worship it. He doesn't have any terribly great interest in whether it's much better than another one, and so forth. And then finally, they had very little export trade. I think part of this was because they were also busy having little private wars, one with the other, and so forth, that they never got around to developing a big export trade. The only two exceptions to this are Vermouth and Marsala. And as I'll point out in a minute, they don't deserve much credit for the Marsala. Well, now we'll go back to our outline. Because of the European Common Market, that's what ECM means on your outline. Because of the European Common Market, the Italians have been forced to develop protected appellations of origin. And they're doing this quite rapidly now. At the last count, there were 94 of them. They're modeled after the German law more than they are after the French law. They will have two kinds of labels, and I won't bother you with giving you the Italian names. One of them will just be controlled appellation. It'll just say controlled appellation. And the other one, with that fine disdain of what's really wrong, the other one will be controlled appellation guarantee, which sort of reduces the effectiveness of the lower appellation. I would have thought of something else for that second one, but they didn't. And so you will see on Italian labels now, appellation controllata, garantia, and I think the other one just appellation controllata. And these will at least guarantee that they came from a certain district, that they were made from certain varieties, but that's about all they will guarantee you for. There is supposed to be some control on the export of wines from Italy, but traditionally that's been rather lax and loose. Well, starting at the far north of Italy now, I'll just make a little map here. Over here next to France is Piedmont. And that's where vineyards look more like French vineyards than any place else in Italy. They're in nice straight rows, they're properly cultivated and so forth. And that's because, of course, the Kingdom of Savoy included a part of France. They speak a dialect which is intermediate between French and Italian. And it's curious that this district has mainly varietal labels. They have wines like Barbera, Fresa, Nebbiolo, and Nebbiolo is the most extensively planted variety, and others of this kind in Piedmont. But then again, this factor here comes into existence. About 25% of all the Piemontese wines that I've tasted, and I think this is generally true, will be gassy. Frizzanti is the Italian word for it. And the Italians have cultivated a taste for this gassy wine. The gassiness comes from bacterial spoilage, and in some cases from fermentation of residual sugar. And when you pour the wine into a glass, it will foam. And you will hear the Italian connoisseur say, "Ooh, look at the schiuma rossa, look at the red foam on the wine." And to them, that's a quality factor, but to us, it's a spoilage factor. It smells like yeast if it's a yeast fermentation, and it smells like sauerkraut if it's a bacterial fermentation in some cases, or at least has an off character. But anyway, that's the sort of thing they have. They have one little regional name, which is, you'll find, and usually quite fairly good wine, more like the Rhone wines, Barolo. Barolo is the name of a town. The wine is made from Nebbiolo, and it's a pretty nice wine. Now, if you go just east of there, you come to the Lombard, Brenner Pass, and northeast corner of Italy. All of these wines are among the better wines of Italy. They're quite frequently named with the name of the variety from which they're made. And if you see one of these wines with the name Cabernet on it, you can be sure it's a Cabernet, or Merlot is another variety they use. Those are Bordeaux varieties, but they have been domesticated in northern Italy. And the reason why I think these wines are so good is that they were run by Germans up until 1918. And the Germans were very good grape growers, and the labels are still in German type and so forth. And as you know, there's a continuing controversy between Austria and Italy as to whether German should be permitted in the schools in the Brenner Pass area and so forth. Anyway, I find these wines to be quite pleasant and pretty good bargains at the present day. Now, the next region is Tuscany. There are a lot of other little intermediate regions. But Tuscany to Americans really means Italian wine. And if the Americans know any Italian wine, it will be one of three. It will be Vermouth, it'll be Marsala, or it'll be Chianti. You pronounce the CH at the beginning of a word, in most Italian words, like a K, Chianti. And Chianti is mostly red. There's no legal white, but occasionally gets it on the market. The red is made from a mixture of red and white varieties, which reduces its color. Chianti is not, as most popular books say, a heavy, coarse, tannic wine fit only for spaghetti. That's not true. It's not coarse because of the white grapes in it. It's not heavy, usually only about 11% of alcohol. And it's not tannic because the Sangiovese and or Sangiovese, Sangiovese we've given it here, St. John, variety doesn't have much tannin. The Colorino does, and the Colorino is used to adjust the color. So they start with Sangiovese, a red grape, add another red grape, which is quite darkly colored, and then some Trebbiano and Malvasia to finish it out. They have a curious, and this normal method of making it, normal method of aging it, produces a fairly standard wine, a good, everyday, table drinking wine. I don't think it ever gets to the character of a well-aged Bordeaux or a well-aged Burgundy, but at least there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the production of Chianti as they make it. That accounts for about 3/4 of all the Chianti that's made. The other fourth of the Chianti that's made is quite a different kind of thing and may justify that old spaghetti tag or tannin tag. The other fourth of it is made by the process called the Governo process. In the Governo process, they make the wine from Sangiovese and Trebbiano and Malvasia, the two white grapes, just like any other wine. They crush them, ferment them on the skins, press them, and put them in the cellar. At the same time, they pick the Colorino grapes, but they don't crush the Colorino grapes. They lay them out in little boxes, or they hang them up by strings and then tie the strings to the ceiling, whole clusters running from one end of the string down to the other end, and they leave them dry, or dehydrate, probably a better word, until January or February. These dark red, small-berried Colorino grapes are then crushed in December or January and added to the extent of about 10% to the new wine. About 10% of the new wine. This increases the color, increases the alcohol content, and vastly increases the chances of spoilage. The process is frowned upon by all enologists that I know of. It is frowned upon by all connoisseurs of Chianti and people who love Chianti wines. but nevertheless it persists, and some of it even gets on the American market. It usually doesn't ferment very well because no self-respecting yeast likes to start work with 10 or 11% of alcohol already there. So the fermentations are slow. They're in the middle of the winter. They sometimes stick. They sometimes last for 1 or 2 years. When the cellar warms up, they'll start to ferment again. So all in all, the Gouverneur process is not a very happy one. Well, most of you will go to Rome sometime in your life, and you will go night clubbing in Rome, in one place or the other, and you will be offered Castelli Romani, the castles of Rome. Depending on the size of the nightclub and so forth, and what they size up your purse to be, you will be offered Castelli Romani Secco, or you'll be offered Castelli Romani Spumante, sparkling. Avoid it. It'll cost you $10 in even a fairly cheap nightclub in the Transverso, and it won't be worth it. It sells at about 60 cents a bottle in the local market, even today, less than $1 today. They add some carbon dioxide to it, and they sell it to the American tourist, the American sucker, for $10 a bottle in a dirty little nightclub where the spaghetti is cold and the music is, I've never really heard good jazz in an Italian nightclub yet. There may be some place where it is, but I haven't heard it. At any rate, that's something to avoid. In fact, avoid all the wines from there south, with few exceptions. The Naples wines are not very good. There's a few Sicilian reds made up on the slopes of the volcano Etna and the eastern end of Sicily that are worth trying. But generally speaking, the best place to enjoy table wines, or the kind of table wines to buy, is from Tuscan north, not from Rome south. Now, they make two wines that are, in their way, classics. One of them they originated, and the other one they did not. As Dr. Singleton's pointed out, there are some flavored wines, that is, wines to which flavors are added. And among these are vermouths, dry vermouth and sweet vermouth. The sweet vermouth particularly originated in Piedmont, in northern Italy. It originated in the 18th century, although it obviously goes clear back to the Greek idea of flavoring wines for various reasons that I've already outlined for you. They took very sweet muscats from this region, and they also bought muscat raisins from a little island down here below Sicily called Pamphlets, and these two were mixed together with anywhere from 15 to 60 different herbs. Most of the herbs were native of Italy. Most of the herbs are a native of Italy, particularly wormwood or absinthe. But some of the herbs were imported from the Orient, and other herbs came from South America, the quinine bark, cinchona bark. These were skillfully blended together, aged for a few years, and acquired a world market in the 19th century. Italian sweet vermouth is still the standard of the trade throughout the world. At a later time, they began to make some dry vermouths, and so did France as far as that's concerned. In the south of France, they make a lot of dry vermouth. These were not muscat flavored, so the big difference between the sweet vermouth and the dry vermouth is not just in the sweetness, but is in the fact that the sweet vermouths originally and typically have a muscat flavor, and they're much darker in color than the dry vermouths. The dry vermouths are on the light yellow side, whereas the sweet vermouths are on the dark amber side. And it's not quite true that dry vermouths are completely dry. They have about 4% sugar. But sweet vermouths are really sweet, 12 to 16% of sugar, depending on the company that you get them from. They come in a variety of types. In Italy, you can buy them for as little as 10 cents a glass to $4 and $5 a bottle, depending on the age and the company they come from. They're greatly exported throughout the world. So much so that the word martini from the firm Martini Rossi is what you get, sweet vermouth, if you order a martini outside of a big luxury hotel in Paris or London. Any place else in Europe, you'll say, I'll have a glass of martini. That doesn't mean a martini cocktail to them. It means a glass of Martini Rossi sweet vermouth from Torino in Italy. So that shows how the word martini has penetrated all of Europe, associated not with a gin cocktail, but associated with a sweet vermouth. The other wine that you should know about, and which you will meet up occasionally, is Marsala. There's a little town on the south coast of Sicily called Marsala. Palermo is just north of it and slightly to the west, and you cross the straits at Messina on the other end of the island. As I told you last time, one of the effects of the Napoleonic Wars was to cut England off from the source of sherry. And one of Wellington's grand plans was to come down through Portugal, move across, and cut the line of communication of the French to the south of Spain, and eventually drive them out of Spain, and then they would reacquire the source of sherry which they needed in England, which is exactly how it occurred. But the Napoleonic Wars didn't last for just a day. They went on for quite a long period of time. And so there was the need for a sherry substitute in England. A number of English people began to look around, just like Americans are looking in other places in the world to grow grapes today. And they finally came to the conclusion that Sicily offered cheap grapes, plenty of labor, and had not been exploited for anything. They went to Marsala and literally created a wine. The British created it. As to a certain extent, they created port. The demand for port in England, it created the industry of port in Portugal. The Portuguese drink very little port. And the same thing is true of Marsala. There wasn't any Marsala there. But by conscious effort, they went in with the most unfavorable circumstances. This is a region of white wines. They were cloudy. Many of them were bacterially contaminated because of the hot climatic conditions. They didn't have much acid. And so that was their first thing, a dry white wine, more or less good. They then took some grape juice and added sulfur dioxide to it, which they had lots of because sulfur is a product of Sicily. And that would keep the grape juice into the winter season. They also took some grape juice in a very ancient Roman process in a big copper pot. They would reduce it down to 1/3 of its previous content by direct fire. And they call this cotto, C-O-T-T-O, which literally means a cooked wine. It's burnt. It smells like molasses. It smells like blackstrap molasses. Very caramelized, quite bitter, and of course quite sweet. And of course they also had alcohol from the distillation of wine. So there's 4 products that they had at this time. A dry white wine, some grape juice preserved with SO2, some cotto, boiled down grape juice, and some alcohol. They mixed these in various and sundry ways. Some of them with very little cotto, some of them with more cotto, some of them with quite a bit of grape juice, some of them with less. Almost all of them up to 15% of alcohol, some of them up to 18% of alcohol. So that they were able to produce, by aging, a range of wines from fairly light colored and fairly dry to very dark colored and very sweet. And they created an export market for these, and before World War I it was appreciable, amounted to several million gallons. The British gradually liquidated their claims in this area, although even as late as 1935 there was still a British cemetery there and a British country club and a British church. And after World War II, the British completely liquidated their interest there, and the trade has decreased in recent years. I think it's because they haven't given that nice attention to blending that the British were so good at, and also they lost the British market, which was no longer able to afford the luxury of every home having an extra bottle of Marsala on the shelf to use in cooking or whatever ways they chose to use it. Well, so much then for Italy. We'll now start with eastern United States. But before we do, I will start with Mexico. Although my section has had this particular part of the lecture, the other sections, I understand, have not. The Spanish had two very interesting ideas when they came to the New World, or two ideas, and whether they're interesting or not. The first idea was they were looking for gold, or spices, which was gold in Europe at that time, worth as much as gold. And the other was, of course, as soon as they discovered the route to the Far East, where they hoped to go, they wanted to convert them to Christianity, the missionary idea. So it was that as soon as Cortez got to Mexico City, immediately thereafter, the conversion process started. And as the number of people in the church increased, the demand for wine for purposes of the celebration of the Mass increased. So here you were, far away from Spain, on a hazardous route with celebrating Mass for thousands of people fairly soon with no wine. So by about 1520 or 1525, they decided to plant some seeds a little north of Mexico City and grow some grapes of their own. And the grape variety that they developed was called Criollo. The Criollo grape spread from Mexico to Peru, from Peru to Chile, and from Chile to Argentina. In the northern direction, it spread up above Guadalajara, over to Baja California, and up California as far as Sonoma. So that's Mexico's first contribution to the New World winemaking thing, a variety of grape which is still found to the extent of several thousand acres in Argentina, and some of them in northern Chile, and perhaps 500 acres of them still left here in California. It was not a very good variety, the Criollo. It had some very great advantages, however, for its time and place. First of all, it ripens very late, ripens at the end of the season, and it doesn't have much color. It's purple, not red. So they couldn't make red wine, and red wine was necessary if possible for the Mass, although white wine has been used and can be used. It was low in acid, so it spoiled very quickly. And it was, even at best, it was only a dirty pink-purple color. Flat tasting, very subject to spoilage. It had one big advantage, however. It produced like mad. It was a wonderful producer. It was not subject to any diseases, as far as we know, even today. It's subject to some, but it's fairly resistant to most of the common fungus diseases. And so it's very clean when it comes off the vine, and it can even be used as a table grape because it's very sweet, and it has even been made into raisins. So here was this high-producing, high-sugar variety with not very subject to diseases that came out of Mexico. Other than that, however, Mexico has its problems because it's warm in Mexico. It's mainly in Region 5. There may be a few higher places in Baja California that are Region 4. It lacks good varieties, although our department has, as much as anybody, has helped them as much as we can. We have several, each year we have several young men here from Mexico. But there is not yet developed that what is so necessary, that general popularity of wine as a beverage of the middle class, to make wine a wide diffusion. Sure, you can find Mexican wines in fancy hotels and tourist restaurants, but you go out past those and you do not find very much of wine. So that there's never been very much criticism of the Mexican wines by the Mexicans themselves. They lack that critical nature, and the wines in general are fairly disappointing. There are several thousand acres of new varieties gone in. There are several new wineries in Mexico, and Mexico, I predict, will, in another 10 or 15 years, will have some wines that will be quite acceptable and quite useful. All right, now going back to eastern United States. When they first came to eastern United States, they found large amounts of grapes, number of different species of grapes, the vitis, and the grapes were very small, very acid, and they had a funny flavor. which they call foxy. Now, I don't know why they called it foxy, because I don't think very many people have been around a fox's lair to smell what a fox smells like. But anyway, that's what they called it. And I don't know whether that's a correct appellation or not for the smell. So they started bringing over grapes from Europe. They brought them over by the shipload. They brought what they call vine dressers, that is, vineyardists over, boatloads of them. In one case, at least, they brought over soil, and they all failed, some sooner and some later. Thomas Jefferson, President Jefferson, tried desperately to get vinifera grapes to grow in Virginia. There were grapes growing in Maryland, 600 acres at one crack at one time. All the best varieties from Europe, the best vine dressers and so forth. But after 2 or 3, 4 years, they began to die off, and in a short period of time, there were not many left. Well, there are about 4 reasons for this. The first thing, Vitis vinifera is not as cold resistant as the Vitis labrusca. So the very cold winters in eastern United States tended to kill off the Vitis vinifera grapes. When you get down to minus 15 and so forth, labruscas will survive, but viniferas get nipped. If they don't get nipped all the way down into the roots, at least the canes were nipped back, the more tender part of the vine, so that you didn't get any crop the next year. Second, they found that it rains in the summertime. They had never heard of fungus diseases. They didn't even know there was such a thing as a fungus disease in the 18th century. And the grapes would start to get ripe, and then before you knew it, there wouldn't be any grapes there. They'd all be rotten right on the vine. Well, that was one of the mildews. In some cases, it prevented the berry from growing. In other cases, it caused the berry to rot. Second, as they moved further south and west, the vinifera, particularly in the Ohio Valley, this was true, the vines would suddenly start to die in one part or another part of the vineyard, and in a couple of years, they would all have died. This was phylloxera. Phylloxera is endemic in this country, in all parts of the country. The American varieties are more or less resistant to them, whereas the European varieties were not. And so at some time or other, phylloxera got into most of the vineyards, if not all of them, and caused them all. And then as we moved further west, we found vines that were apparently dying for no apparent reason. They just died. And this was virus diseases of various kinds. We seem to be the home of most of the virus diseases of grapes, if not all of them. These have been taken to Europe, and they've spread through Europe. At least several of the more important ones originated in this country. So for these 4 reasons, they couldn't develop a wine industry. They substituted for developing a wine industry by developing a peach industry, peach brandy. They substituted for bringing in wines from Marsala, and they substituted most of all the production of whiskey. America's only original contribution to alcoholic beverages is bourbon whiskey. The revealing secret of this particular process was the storing of grain spirits in charred barrels, which gives bourbon whiskey its characteristic flavor. This was an original creation, greatly admired by many people, and they developed it in all kinds of forms and so forth, from rye whiskey in Maryland, where it's still popular, to barley, wheat whiskeys, sour mash in many cases. That is, the fermentation was allowed to go until bacterially infected in Kentucky, where there is a Bourbon County, which finally gave its name to it, or to just plain, colorless, bottled fire called corn whiskey in the southern United States, where my family comes from and about which I know something about. Avoid it. But by about 1800, they turned again to the native grapes and tried to do something with them, and they eventually domesticated about 1,500 varieties, either domesticated or hybridized, about 1,500 varieties of American grapes. These had resistance to winter killing, resistance to fungus diseases. They were more or less resistant to phylloxera. And by selection, by observation, by looking, botanizing whole regions, they were able to develop a fair number of these varieties. In some cases, they may have been inadvertent crosses between vinifera and labrusca in home gardens, because there were still a few viniferas around. They would survive. People would cover them up like we do geraniums here at Davis when we're smart, and so forth. And so that we got a few of these domesticated. They were still all foxy, but the berries were much bigger. They were sweeter than the wild ones, the wild strains, and they had less acid than the wild strains. And they could be trained. Some of the wild ones grew quite wildly, but some of these could be trained. So the commercial varieties, one of the first ones was Isabella, which is red. Another one was Ives seedling, which is also red, developed by a man by the name of Ives. Nothing to do with the composer, I'm sorry to say. Delaware, which is pink, seems to be a hybrid between vinifera and labrusca. It's perhaps the sweetest of all the wine grape varieties in the eastern United States. Niagara, which has quite a foxy flavor, but is white and quite desired for making jellies, and some people make wine out of it. Catawba was particularly famous in the Ohio Valley. It's a russet-colored variety from which white wine is made. You can buy Catawba sparkling grape juice in the local Safeway store. At least you can in Sacramento. And then finally, and most important of all, a chance either seedling or a chance cross in Concord, Massachusetts, of all places, the Concord grape, which now represents about 80% of all the grapes east of the Rocky Mountains. The Concord is a great big grape. It's easy to train, has large crops, and has a lot of flavor. This industry is located in New York, in Missouri, in Michigan, in Ohio, the main states. Let me just say about two other things, and then we'll start with California next Tuesday. In the southern states, there were no labruscas, and they used their native grape, the rotundifolias. These are sometimes called the muscadine or the scuppernong grapes. The muscadine or the scuppernong grapes. They are not muscats. Now, surely as God made little green apples, somebody will tell me in the final examination that the grapes that grow in southern United States are muscats. So far as I know, there are no muscats growing south of the Mason-Dixon line. Muscadine is just a name that was given to them from a species man. They're all Vitis rotundifolia. They look like cherries. They have a rather unpleasant flavor, in my opinion, and the wines they make therefrom are not much better. And then the final question is, can Vitis vinifera be grown with all of our modern knowledge in eastern United States? Well, there are several people that say they can. Dr. Frank has devoted a lifetime now to proving it, and all I'd like to see is the size of his bank account. If he's been successful, he's certainly not gotten rich on it. And there's something about the bank account which establishes whether something is successful or not. In the wine business, at least that's true. They're still subject to winter killing unless you cover them in some years. There may be a few favored locations around lakes or up on sides of rivers where viniferas will grow. It's hard for me to believe that changing the rootstock will make vinifera grapes more resistant to winter hardiness. And it's hard for me to believe that if you lose your crop 2 times out of 10, or more, that you can have a successful business. At any rate, they are making some vinifera grapes in eastern United States. They're very hardy souls. It's like a religion. They've been converted. I predict that this will continue, and some of them will be quite good. And I hope they do succeed for their own personal sake. But most of the vinifera grapes for the distant future are going to come from the Pacific Slope, Washington, Oregon, and California, and that's where we'll start next time.